Greetings, fellow travelers through the liturgical year. This is Lisa Davis with not so much a feast day quick take as an amazing tale to go with the feast of St. Michael. Have you heard of the sword of St. Michael? We touched on it in a podcast on St. Michael that we'll link in the show notes if you missed it. But to tell it briefly, in the same way that constellations are drawn on the sky, tracing invisible dotted lines from star to star, the sword of St. Michael is an earthbound constellation drawn across Europe by connecting 7 monasteries dedicated to the great archangel. Swooping over 2,600 miles north to south, beginning on the island of Skellig Michael in County Kerry, Ireland, the sword passes through St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall, England, Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy, France, Sacra San Michele in Turin, Italy, the Santuario de San Michele in Foggia, Italy, Santo Monasterio di Taxiarchi Michael on the island of Simi in Greece, and ending at the Monasterio de Stella Maris de Monte Carmelo, northwest of Jerusalem in Israel. Every one of these stars on the constellation comes with an amazing story of saints and angels. I think every year we'll have to showcase a new one. Each is remarkable. But on a macro level, the sword is divinely inspired. A certain kind of fanciful science has over the years claimed St. Michael's sword a ley line, which drags mighty St. Michael into the realm of fancy that dabbles in supposed mystical energies and aliens. But we know better. There are no accidents in the universe. No human figuring lined up the points on the map like this a millennium ago, and this straight line connecting Catholic monasteries was not drawn by aliens. It's clear that God purposefully marked the Christian world with the might of St. Michael. This slash of his sword through Europe represents the divine answer to the challenge of Lucifer. Michael, in the name of God, wields the sword of truth. Who is like unto God? He demanded of the rebellion. It was a rhetorical question, a statement actually, a challenge to a lie. The great warrior St. Michael's words were the sword in a manner of speaking. The truth of God's omnipotence is the sword, the routing of evil. And the words of truth, the sword of truth, are quite literally Mikael, which means etymologically, as you probably know, who is like unto God. Michael, then, is the answer to all challenges to the truth, because God is truth, and truth is God. This makes St. Michael a particularly important crusader to enlist during these times of unprecedented worldwide deception and fakery. But back to the sword. If you Google the symbolism of swords, you'll come up with the words power, protection, strength, and courage. In light of what we know about the sword of St. Michael, this seems just about right. The symbol of a sword of truth works well in times when the show of might in battles has been justified, such as in the Crusades or in the defense of the innocent. But a sword can just as easily be seen as a symbol of aggression when its use isn't virtuous, when it's wielded in vanity or greed. Many a tale in the history of mankind balances on the edge of this sword of sanctity versus worldliness. Today's amazing story of St. Michael explores this edge between worldliness and piety, aggression and peace, and takes us on a journey to the possible origins of the world's most famous sword, the sword of Arthurian legend, Excalibur. In the middle of the 12th century, in the town of Ciusdino in Tuscany, near modern-day Siena, an ordinary child was born to ordinary parents, about whom little is known, save that they seem to have been moderately prosperous, able to provide their son all the benefits of a worldly life, within, of course, the parameters of the Catholic faith, which were at that time the common denominator of most Italians. Growing up a charming and handsome young man, it's told in legend that he had wavy golden hair. This child, whose name was Galgano Guidati, rose to the rank of a knight known for his ability on the battlefield. He was, it seems, the toast of the town, admired by all, and as so often happens, flattery, and the temptations of the world drew him away from the practice of his faith. According to the histories, his story arc follows a similar pattern to St. Francis of Assisi. Well into his 20s, young Galgano almost always missed Mass, but never missed a party. Known throughout the province for spinning wildly humorous tales, he was an affectionately tolerated wastrel who was not expected to amount to much. So it was that, like the boy who cried wolf, when Galgano claimed that the Archangel Michael had appeared to him and showed him a beautiful round church on a hill, the 12 apostles standing around the perimeter, of course no one believed him. How could he expect they would? But it was true. He dreamed at first the vision of St. Michael, and passed it off as the result of too much whining and dining. The impressions, however, did not fade as the dreams of a drunken stupor would. They stayed with him in the front of his mind. The billowing cloak of the archangel and his stern countenance, the almost physical pressure of the measuring gaze of the apostles upon him. He couldn't stop thinking about it. It became a mental roadblock to any other thought. Every joke he tried to make sounded hollow. Every plan for merriment felt contrived and anticlimactic. He felt himself spinning into an unaccustomed vortex of self-consciousness. It just would not do. His friends more inclined than anything to make him a figure of jest, he brought his worries to his mother, who suggested he waste not another moment, but pack a bag, saddle his horse, and ride to the neighboring province to visit his intended bride, who was, as was the custom of the time, chosen for him by his parents. "She's a lovely girl," his mother said, and very likely all he needed was a change of scenery and the distraction of a pretty face. It was, after all, high time Galgano grew up and started acting like a responsible adult. Perhaps this was all his conscience telling him so. Grow up, Galgano. Go make good with your future in-laws. So he saddled his horse, the well-loved and accustomed mount that obeyed without question his slightest indication, and headed over the hills to his future wife. He hadn't traveled more than a few leagues, however, than his horse refused to obey his pull on the reins. When Galgano signaled left, the horse turned right. When he pulled to slow him to a walk, the horse increased to a canter. When he leaned heavily backward and called "Whoa!" the horse, blast his hide, increased to a gallop. And when he rounded into a valley carpeted in gorse, the horse stopped suddenly, throwing Galgano over his head to the ground, which was at least cushioned with a low-growing shrub which broke his fall. Galgano lay for a moment, stunned, staring at the blue sky above him, when, as clear as if someone were standing behind his shoulder, he heard a resonant voice say, "Retire here and build a house to the glory of God, the Virgin Mary, and the Apostles." Galgano blinked in disbelief, then brushed himself off as he stood and surveyed his surroundings. He was alone, but rising in front of him, at the crest following the upslope of the valley, he saw the hill he'd seen in his dream, the exact hill, but without the church at the top. He rubbed his eyes. Yes, it was this hill, Montesiepe. As he watched, the outline of a round church, the very one he'd seen in his dream, seemed to materialize at the top of the hill. He climbed toward it, determined to prove to himself that it was just another dream, a hallucination brought on by the fall from the horse, instigated by his obsession over the dream. He was sure of it. As he approached the top of the hill, coming from beneath a thick stand of scrub oak, he saw that the church had disappeared. There, then, it was his imagination. But there was that low-pitched voice again, telling him to renounce all worldly pleasures and possessions. Galgano whirled around, peering beneath the oak trees. Not a soul shared the hilltop with him, not even a bird in sight. The voice repeated its command. "Retire here, renounce all worldly pleasures and possessions." Galgano answered, calling to the empty air, "Forsooth would I gladly obey this command, but perhaps you know not. I could no sooner do such a thing than split this rock with my sword." For there in front of him was a rock outcropping about as high as his knee. In exasperation, and to prove his point more to himself than the disembodied voice, he drew his sword and struck the rock with all his strength, expecting that the blade would snap. But, like a hot knife through butter, the blade sank into the rock, almost up to the hilt. The symbol now protruding from the outcropping? A cross. Galgano never left the hill after that. Thoroughly convinced and touched by the grace of God, he became a holy hermit. At first considered mad, and his story of the voice of St. Michael a wild delusion, even those who knew him best eventually recognized that he was a changed man. Sincere in his piety and penitence, the fame of the hermit on Monte Siepe spread throughout the region. Legend says that he befriended the wild animals that populated the hills. Specifically recalled in legend is a pack of wolves that became his frequent companions. Local farmers made the trek to the mountaintop to ask counsel and blessings from the holy hermit, and word spreading, people from the towns and villages made the journey. Miracles began to be recorded that were worked by his intercession and prayers. Gargano Guidati died only about a year after retiring to his rough hermitage on the mountain, receiving his eternal reward on December 3, 1181, at the age of 33. His fame having spread quickly, however, and his influence impressive, several bishops and abbots attended his funeral, and within a year the Bishop of Volterra gave permission to the Cistercian order to build a shrine to Galgano's memory over his small hermitage. His canonization process began in 1185. The acts of this canonization process are the oldest to have survived in the records of the Church. Among the miracles recorded is the testimony that after Galgano's death, his scalp continued for some years to continue to grow blonde curls. And to this day, pilgrims can visit the ruins near the Abbey of St. Galgano to see the cross-shaped sword of St. Galgano, since proven scientifically to date to the 12th century, embedded to its hilt in a jagged rock that protrudes from the center of the tile floor in the circular end of Monte Siepe Chapel. Interestingly, the first recorded telling of the Arthurian sword in the stone drama comes from a 13th century poem written by Robert de Boron at about the same time as the true stories of St. Galgano would have been circulating. But de Boron got it backward. While young King Arthur's removal of the sword in the stone signified his worldly claim of an earthly kingdom, the real sword in the stone had everything to do with the renunciation of the world and the gaining of an eternal place in the kingdom of heaven. Galgano stood on the edge of a sword, and with the counsel of the great archangel chose peace and piety. He made of the sword a cross, the more truly powerful and courageous decision. Saint Galgano, pray for us. Help us also to choose wisely. Saint Michael the Archangel, pray for us. Protect us. Be our defense against the wiles of the devil in this wicked world. Blessed be God in his angels and in his saints.